Dr. Miller, thank you so much for being with us today.
It is such a joy.
I've been looking forward to this conversation, and I want to start with inviting you to share with us a little bit about your own personal journey that led you to focus on neuroscience and spirituality.
So, Reverend Lisa, I have been a clinical scientist and clinical psychologist since the mid 90s. And when I started out, I was training on an inpatient unit, which for its time was a very innovative, respectful, caring place. But it was simply a truth that our patients were not getting better. This was an urban hospital in a highly respected system. And what I saw as a new psychologist was that people would come in, we'd discharge them, and they'd be back 6 months, a year later. And so ineffective was this effectively a revolving door treatment process that I'd have to even say that most patients were getting worse. So I figured that we're here to learn, whether we're brand new or 10 years or 40 years into the work. And what were the patients saying? And what the patients were saying was quite revealing. I'll give you examples. There was a woman who, having been in and out over 20 times to this inpatient unit, was about to be sent upstate, which is really, if you will, not a death sentence to your body, but to your freedom. So upstate she was headed the next day, and she stopped me in the middle of the inpatient hallway. The linoleum lights, the smelly fluids, stopped me in the hallway. And I said, Dr. Miller, I need you. She wasn't my patient, and in that time, it was a little bit taboo to talk to other people's patients, so-called patients. So she was asking, and in my heart, I knew the only answer was yes. So I said, yes. How can I help you? I'm being taken upstate. Will you come with me? And I said, come with you where? And she said, well, down the hall this way. And we went down the smelly hall into the kitchen, back into the pantry, and in the corner of the pantry was a little pots and pans nook. And standing there where no one else could hear us, Dr. Miller, will you pray with me? She was Catholic, I'm Jewish, and she knew that, and it was not for 1 minute a barrier. She knew that she was reaching out to someone who would be grateful and honored to pray with her. And so by the pots and pans, she took out her rosary and she prayed the rosary. And then at the end, she prayed, she said, dear God, please protect me when I go upstate. And dear God, please protect Dr. Miller. How selfless in her moment of crisis. Yeah. And then she turned to me and she said, now, Dr. Miller, you pray your way. And so I prayed the way that my mother had taught me. And at the end, I said, and please, dear God, watch over I'll call her Ms. Jones. May she know that you're always with her. The next day I came back. Her bed was made. She was gone.
Oh, my gosh.
So life tells you, God tells us when, there's only one answer, and it's yes. Her journey and countless others like that on the inpatient unit, where the hunger of the heart was for spiritual connection, to walk with me spiritually together as we pray to God, where we find support, love, guidance through God together. That was the message loud and clear, time and time again. And yet there wasn't a peep, not one word in traditional mental health training that addressed the deep spiritual heart of the patient. And after a number of these experiences, I decided that in my work as a clinical scientist, this was the most important dimension of human renewal, of recovery, of finding a life that was spiritually and emotionally full. So I spent my next 25 years looking into this through epidemiology, MRI studies, genotyping studies, developing new clinical interventions. It became my life work because that's what the patients said they needed.
This is profound and really provocative, frankly, to come at spirituality from the place of science. I mean, you are a scientist and a deeply spiritual person, so I want to get at the science. And before we do that, I just want to say that in the tradition that I have come from, Methodist tradition, we we value deeply insights of science. But I would say we haven't typically come to spirituality from the place of science. And so yes, we value it. And I would love to hear you talk about the science behind your work.
Well, I think, Reverend Lisa, you're raising a very important point, which is for a very long time, there were two camps of voices. And one camp would say, I am a deeply spiritual and religious person. I know the truth within. I need no science to prove it. Mm. And the other camp would say, I'm a profoundly scientific person. It must be shown through the rigor of science, or I don't take it to be true. Well, those very divided camps, I think, now can come together. We now know that spirituality and science go hand in hand, particularly when we use the lens to look at the impact of lived human spirituality in the rest of our lives. And particularly when we use the lens to look at those threads of lived human spiritual life to find their origin in our community, parenting, faith leaders' innate capacity. So if we're looking at the origin or the expression as spiritual life reaches across the rest of our lives, a clinical scientist has a good lens. But we do not, we're certainly unqualified. I am not qualified to tell you the meaning of the nature of reality. I'm not qualified to tell you how God works. Those are theological questions. But I can tell you, using the lens of science, that we have a pretty good lens. For most of the 20th century, there was barely anything investigated or published on spirituality in the course of a human life. But that was through no limitation of the scientific method. The method is very straightforward, rigorous. It is the lens, whether it's a telescope, a microscope, an MRI study, a long-term clinical course study. The lens is the lens. It only points in the direction as guided by the scientist. In other words, the limit in the 20th century was not in the lens of science as a method. It was in the limitations of the scientists as we were embedded in cultural vogues and, sort of hot new topics in the profession. The fact of the matter is, finally now, we have 20 good years of science. Really, the past 10 are superb. And I can share with you in summation what we know. In the Awakened Brain, I go into all of the science studies in greater detail. And the Awakened Brain also has cases that reflect the science so that you can take that in. But here I'm going to share with you the core, looking out the airplane window, the 20,000 foot view of what's really important to know for all people who care and love and help heal those who cross our paths from a spiritual perspective.
Great.
Does that make sense?
Yes, please do. Yes.
Most important finding from science, period, was developed in 1997 and replicated in 1999. And the finding is that every human being on earth is an innately spiritual being. Just as we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and a nose, every single baby is born with the endowment of a capacity for spiritual life. And in particular, there are at least 2 threads of lived human spiritual life with which we are born. And the first is an innate capacity to be in a transcendent relationship with whom I call God, whether you say Jesus, Hashem, the universe. And the second is that we might feel this relationship, this sacred transcendent relationship, and our love for one another as sisters, as brothers, love of neighbor. Those are both forms of relational spirituality. My lived, felt, dynamic relationship with God, who I call God, and the presence of God and my love for fellow human beings. And I would say that extends to the earth, fellow living beings. Now, how do we know that? Big claim, right? Well, any human capacity can be understood as a factor of genes and environment in its formation when we use a twin study. We look at twins raised together, twins raised apart, and factor out the commonality as a function of shared environment, shared genes.
Okay. So to get at nature versus nurture, or to get at, okay.
Exactly. Beautifully put, Reverend. So temperament. I'm sure if you've ever seen little babies, and particularly if you've seen 2, you know that they are not identical in their temperament in the first 3 months of life. I have 3 children. And the middle child, who has asked me to call her the center child, was born
Nice.
with a temperament, surprisingly enough, which kept her up and us 4 times a night for a year and a half. So 4 times a night for 18 months, that sweet little sound that does need help, So I'd get up, I'd march across the house. That was her innate temperament, and I would soothe the baby environment. 50% inborn, 50% environmental. She's 20 now. She sleeps through the night.
Nice.
Yes, right. She's allowed me to say she's at times anxious. Her temperament, as all of ours, is half innate, half environmentally formed. IQ, 60% innate, 40% environmentally formed. So you're sharing this with many leaders. Everyone's bright. Well, they were born bright. Okay. Now, similarly, when we work with people who are struggling, they're struggling. Let's walk with them with understanding and compassion. Right. So the capacity through which we experience spiritual life is 1/3 innate.
Wow.
This is our birthright. And yet it is also 2/3 environmentally formed. There's a rich embrace in the formation of the spiritual core. That rich embrace is, of course, our parents, our grandparents, our pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, our 10,000 exchanges by the school locker, and culture and climate of our school and community. As we grow older, we pick our environment, and we might know how very important it is to pick one that's consistent with formation of spiritual life, and so too for our children. But 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed starts to help us understand why we have never seen so many young people with an atrophied spiritual core. 20 years ago, it was simply not the case. I mean, certainly, today there are wonderful young people with a strong spiritual core, but never have so many suffered for atrophy of
Let's
core.
jump into that. Say more about that, will you?
So Reverend Lisa, 40 years ago, I'm sure you're well aware as our, community today, that the United States, in a good attempt to be inclusive, threw all religion out of the public square. And it turned out not to be inclusive, but instead, time showed us radically exclusive. We lost from our public square the rich embrace of pluralism, where you tell me about your Christmas or Easter, and as a Jew, I tell you about Passover or Hanukkah, and my good friend fills me in about Diwali in her home. We lost the ability to share openly, joyously, outwardly in our boardrooms, schoolrooms, and everywhere else that we convene, the most important part of our lives, our spiritual core. And with the silencing in the public square, we also threw the spiritual baby out with the bathwater, to the point we are no longer spiritually or religiously conversant as a society. And where there's silence, society has a problem. When we didn't talk about death and dying, people whispered, "I have cancer," right? When we didn't talk about rights of individuals, they whispered their identity quietly and kept it under wraps. Where there's silence, there's a problem. And our growth right now must include the rich embrace of spiritual diversity. Can we know each other more? I want to know you, and I want to be connected in the deepest part of your inner being, your heart, your core. That's the spiritual core. So because we have a public square silent on spiritual life, we now have a generation of young people. 40 years is long enough for someone to grow up, have a baby who grows up and is at your door, whether this is a high school or a high university, whether it's the U.S. military or an entry-level job. Our institutions in the United States have never received young adults with as little strength at their deepest spiritual core. There are 18 through 25-year-olds who never prayed ever or meditated by the side of a parent or grandparent, never read any sacred text. I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of this, have no notion that morality is written from an absolute relationship to who I call God. You cherry pick what you think. A public square minus a spiritual core is a transactional public square. And we increasingly in the square treat people transactionally.
God, this is so important for us right now as we think about the role of the church. So in this series, we're talking about formation, and it's been our premise and our observation that the church has lost its voice, that has become timid, and I think this is what you're describing. I don't know that I would have had words around what you're describing now, but it's almost as if the church has bought in to this sort of corporate throwing out of the baby with the bathwater. And I don't mean in our values and our understanding of who we are, but in terms of how we have lived out our place in the public square. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that in our institutions, like the silencing of our voice, beyond Christian congregations, but kind of broader.
So, Reverend Lisa, I'll share with you that I've worked for 2.5, nearly 3 years with the United States Pentagon, because their 18 through 25-year-olds are the same slice of American pie with which we all work, right? They are no different than my students at Columbia or Barnard in the atrophy of the core, in having been raised in a world silent on religious and spiritual life. And there, it's very interesting. The chaplaincy, as led by Chief of Chaplains, a 2-star general, Tom Soljem, took up the charge of helping to reinfuse natural spiritual life back into the Army culture. And so with partnerships, which I share with you because as leaders, as faith leaders, we need you. We need you so much. And I don't think there's anyone who can take your place. So I think this model that was invented, the Army often moves the needle for society. The Army often
yes.
or, comes up with a new way of approaching things socially or culturally. So there's now partnerships throughout the chaplaincy with behavioral health, with the drill sergeants, with the commanding general. The chaplain, the faith leader, has drawn into partnership with all bands of professional expertise and contributions, so that in some, there's a shift in the relational culture. It is no longer merely a transactional culture.
Nice.
It is a transformational culture with, of course, Martin Buber's notion of the I-thou relationship.
Yes.
I truly have your best interest in mind, as well as that of the overall functioning of this organization. So you are extremely expert in something that is really a gaping hole in the United States culture right now, which is the spiritual journey in life and what supports and cultivations can be brought to the spiritual journey and who can we really be. I'll share with you that I teamed up with a good colleague, Dr. Senior Luther, and we tried to put our heads together. As you know, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued a once in administration warning. Back in my day, the warning from the Surgeon General was smoking may be dangerous for your health. Well, right now, here in December, Surgeon General Murthy issued an advisory on the epidemic of the diseases of despair, addiction, depression, and suicide in teens and young adults. So, I have 3 18 through 25-year-olds. As a parent, I've got to face the reality that, they don't just live in my home. They walk out the door, they go to college, right? So I'm 56. When I was 16, I didn't know anyone who had attempted suicide, but all 3 of my children have talked someone back from suicide.
Wow.
When my daughter was in 8th grade, she said, I know something's wrong, Mommy. 8th grade, I know something's wrong. Johnny's been gone 2 days. I said, 2 days? I said, Johnny probably has the flu. No, Mommy, I just know something's wrong. You must call his mother. So I got on the phone, I called Johnny's mother, and she said, we are so touched that Lila thought of us. Johnny's on the inpatient unit. Can I give you the number on the inpatient unit for her to call over to him? And she calls over, and his parents had recently been divorced. There was a lot of pain in his heart. And he'd taken a knife and carved a heart on his leg before attempting suicide. So that is an experience that when I was in 8th grade, I didn't have. And I can tell you that very same child came running up to me, Lila, with the phone. Mommy, you've got it. She wants to help. She wants to heal, like all children. Every child wants to heal. This woman, she said, on my phone here, this girl on my phone here, she's going to take her life. And sure enough, on the Instagram, I can't take it. I've been in pain 2 months, right? I'm taking my life. So what would you have thought would follow? Tell your parents, get help, this will pass, you've got to hold on. No, you go, girl. It's your life. No one can tell you what to do with it. We can no longer locate diagnosis, suffering, despair at the level of the individual. This is a culture and climate crisis. Our entire society needs to put spiritual heart, our deepest spiritual core, back into the center of who we are, how we know each other, how we treat each other. And you are the perfect leaders to help us do that. Of course, in a way that is pluralistic and inclusive. But at the same time, it's really not that hard, because all of us, we know through science, 1/3 innate, we have the same foundational spiritual endowment. Just as we're involved, each of us is endowed with a system through which to see the outside world, a vision system, an auditory system. We're born with a system to perceive the sacred transcendent. It's 1/3 innate. So there is a universal spiritual brain. We all have it, whether we are Christian, Catholic, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, one spiritual brain. So interfaith is this beautiful blend of pluralism with universal spiritual awareness. And it's our faith leaders from all traditions. Please help us. Let's move,
Well, I'm hearing you also, it's an invitation to bring the fullness of your tradition, not check it at the door, but bring the fullness of your tradition to the public square, to the conversations, to the community, to the neighborhood, and welcome others to bring theirs as well. It's an invitation to bring the fullness. And that feels so encouraging and empowering and
and enlivening.
Yeah.
Our lives are back when we do that.
Yeah.
So I fully agree. The more of you and the more of your faith tradition, the better, the richer, the more vibrant. The thousands of years of inspired guidance, the direct relationship with who I call God. That is how to live as we are. We now through science inherently built. We are sick and empty because we have disintegrated our core from how we are built to live. We know this. It's clear as day in science. So I'll share with you a few more scientific facts.
I'd love that.
Okay, great. So I'm going to give you a scientific look at we are here. When you go on a hike, you first see the map. There's a little red arrow. You are here, right? But there's a great landscape and a series of choices and paths in front of us. So knowing that we're innately spiritual beings, we know that a 2/3 embrace that revitalizes spiritual relationship will strengthen the spiritual core. Right? Well, even though we have never faced as great an epidemic in the diseases of despair in young people, we have a roadmap for a way out. The first piece of evidence is that with the sharp escalation in the diseases of despair has been concomitantly a sharp decline in personal spiritual life and family faith observance. And the two statistically go hand in hand, which means that if we can reverse the downward decline, we can support, across at the level of a country, spiritual renewal and mental health renewal. The second piece of data, which is magnificent, is that if we look across the course from middle adolescence to late adolescence to emerging adulthood, there is a growth spurt. Just as we start to look different physically, as all of our traditions know, there's a growth spurt spiritually. We come of age. We stand before our community, whether it's through confirmation or bar and bat mitzvah or the inipi or the sweat lodge. And science mirrors this through a longitudinal twin study through which we see a 50% increase in the heritable contribution to spiritual awareness, which means, from the inside out, there's a biological clock. Wake up. We have no choice. And there's a hunger of heart for connection and the numinous and the transcendent in every middle, late adolescent, emerging adult. And there's a nagging to know, what is my purpose? But I don't just mean, will I be a teacher or a lawyer? I mean, ultimate purpose as a soul on earth, as a being of God. What is my purpose here? And what is the deep truth about the nature of life? This is a surge of spiritual awakening, and the capacity expands. With that booting up, that surge of capacity, it can feel like a half empty glass of spirituality. Sure, there's moments of connection and illumination and mystical moments that are extraordinary. And then there's very painful, hard times of, wait a minute, everything you ever told me, Mom, Dad, Reverend Lisa, I'm testing it against my own heart. And is it true? And if I'm at a college, like 98% of colleges that say, no, it's not true in the air and water, that's a tough developmental task. And I can share with you that spiritually coming of age, if supported, strengthens the core. But what we have right now is spiritual coming of age with very little support, very little support on campuses. And it makes this developmental task that much more difficult.
Wow.
Why? Because in the spiritual awakening, the emergence of augmented capacity, the first existential coming up, the sort of ignition of this process, is spiritual hunger, which feels existentially like depression. It is a developmental depression. It is not a DSM in the classic sense depression. And college counselors, wherever I go, tell me, 2/3 of my caseload is really not what we mean by DSM depression. It's this hunger for ultimate meaning and purpose. It's what you're calling developmental depression, which is the ignition or the knock at the door for spiritual emergence and awakening. Well, our young people right now are doing that. Very important work. But they're doing it in a context without a whole lot of spiritual and religious support.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's where, once again, you as faith leaders can make all of the difference. In fact, you will make the difference of a lifetime in that student's journey.
Wow. So this notion of developmental depression that is actually a hunger, that feels, and you're talking about it in terms of a stage of life, which makes all the sense in the world. And I kind of wonder if it's happening culturally or corporately in our country. Is what we're feeling, because we have been noticing and reading about and anecdotally researching, if you will, that there seems to be this rise in spirituality, but it's really rise in spiritual hunger. But with that comes a kind of despair and malaise about where do I pursue that? And it's not, if it's not in what's the inherited models of congregations, then where do I go? And so there's a sense of kind of existential loneliness that rises because of that. So I'm connecting these observations that we've made with what you're saying. So is that true? Is that making sense?
I fully resonate. I share your view, Reverend Lisa. I feel that our culture at large is in a state of developmental depression. This is the knock at the door for our own spiritual awakening and deepening.
Yeah.
So developmental depression is actually a gift, even though it's uncomfortable and it causes us to question and probe existentially and, lose our old way of being for something new that we've yet to discover. But we're in a shared developmental depression, which is the opportunity for society, if we say yes and engage it as such, shift our conversation with life from what had been really, repetitively, monolithically, what do I want? How am I going to get it? We were taught tactics, strategy, and we need that stuff to some extent, but achieving awareness alone is completely insufficient to deal with the deeper, more powerful journey in life. And so if we can shift from what do I want and how am I going to get it to a new conversation, what is life showing me now? What is God asking of me now? What is the deep presence, the sacred in and through all life revealing to me and us now? That is a dialogue. That is a dialogue. I call it awakened awareness because we're awakening our naturally spiritual brain. And awakened awareness is not just a belief. It is a seat of perception. And we've even shown in the human brain the circuits that support for all of us this seat of transcendent lived relationship.
Dr. Miller, I have chills all over because what you're saying makes so much sense and is an invitation, again, not to every individual to bring the fullness of who we are, but you're inviting the church to be the church, right? You're inviting the church to step into this kind of corporate developmental depression, but also at strategic points along the way, which is what, I mean, this is who we are. This is what we do best when we own it and claim it and live it. And I literally have chills with what you're saying because I'm so excited.
And you can walk us through it really is a dark night of the soul, the knock at the door through which we cross over into a new spiritual landscape. You know how to do this. And I don't know where else we're going to find the help.
Yeah, may it be so. Wow. So I appreciate this so much because I think you're speaking. First of all, I think you're helping spiritual leaders not feel crazy about how hard this is. And when we look across the country, we look at our communities, we look at our young people, and it feels hard, and you're naming it. It is hard. And you're reminding us that we have a beautiful and important role to play. And some of that is in, core beliefs and teachings, but it's more than that. It's asking the question. It's naming the reality. It's truly seeing young people, individuals where they are and helping them name where they are and allow them to be hungry, spiritually hungry. And then, of course, among their peers and in sacred spaces to feed that hunger with the richness of our story and our narrative and our ability to question and dive in. And so thank you.
And as you suggest, it's it's an emergency in our young people.
Yeah.
And it's present for all of us in every decade of life.
Yeah.
That the knock at the door, the despair, the existential, truly, if we think we don't know where we're going, really don't, that is a confusing, disorienting place to be. And the knock at the door can be heard as not just aspirational hope, but the literal, throw me the golden rope of hope. Because we are now following the golden rope on our journey spiritually. Yeah. And with a faith leader beside us, you understand this terrain. There's names for this journey. There's practices that can help us grow ever more into dialogue with God or our higher power. Yeah. There's ways of doing this together as a journey group. Pilgrimage. It's really a cultural pilgrimage.
It is.
And it's glorious. It's actually magnificent. It just hurts at the beginning.
Yeah, it hurts. It's important to note that, right? That it hurts at the beginning. So, Dr. Miller, I don't want to end our time without touching on your book, The Spiritual Child, because I feel like it has so much to say to us as the church. I mean, we believe in and have claimed the role of forming really every individual through their life, but certainly children. And so as you think about our role in spiritual formation of children, what should we know? I mean, I know this is too brief a time to do all that we could do with this topic, but what should we know? And where have you noticed that we've kind of missed the mark or fallen short or gotten wrong, as we think about our role in forming children?
So in both The Spiritual Child and The Awakened Brain, I try to emphasize that in aggregate, science shows us that the protective benefits of spiritual life against the diseases of despair are so enormous. I mean, a young person with a strong spiritual core is 80% less likely to meet DSM diagnosis for addiction to drugs and alcohol. That went into the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the premier child psychiatry journal. That is a fact based on a national sample. So if a teen is raised to say, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. If I have a tough decision to make, where am I going to go to school? Am I going to break up with him? Where's God in my friendships and my boyfriend relationship? That is not just a belief, it's a felt relationship. It is knowing that we are loved and held, we're guided, and we're never alone. And we can show you in our fMRI studies, in the Awakened Brain, I map this out, the seat of neuroperception, if you will, the docking station. I certainly would not want to claim biological determinism. It is only the neurodocking station
Docking
for the
station.
transcendent relationship. Well, 80% less likely to be addicted, 70% less likely to take dangerous risks like jump out the second story window at a party, drive 90 miles an hour. In a meta-analysis, so a study of studies, to yield 2,000 plus tragically completed suicides, 5,000 matched controls, we're 62% less likely to take our life when we have a strong spiritual and religious core. And that goes up to 82% when spiritual life is shared, shared in fellowship, shared whether it's through youth ministry or sitting side by side my grandparents, or there is somewhere else to go where I learn a direct relationship to God as guiding, loving, and holding. It doesn't matter what comes my way. And in fact, our children are going to inherit a very volatile and unpredictable world. And the greatest gift that I wish for my children is not that they ace AP chemistry, it's that they can develop a sacred relationship through which they find guidance in very unpredictable waters. Guidance that is far greater than all of our historical knowledge looking over my back left shoulder, the high pixel hit that's going to have forward-looking wisdom. So, yeah, bottom line, that 82% less likely, that is the ultimate mental health crisis of our time, suicide. The rate of death by suicide surpasses the rate of death by auto accident in high school. The greatest killer of youth is suicide. And yet, we have the antidote. I mean, if I told you there was this little red pill you could pick up at Walgreens, CVS, and your kids, 18 through 25, would be 4/5 protected against the epidemic. I mean, that's what the vaccine goes for, 4/5, right? We would line up and do anything for our child. So this is ours. This is a realization of our sacred birthright. And we know that through MRI studies that show the neurodocking station for our transcendent relationship and relational spirituality towards one another. Genotyping studies, long-term clinical course studies. If you look at a teen, let me put it this way. When we are mean age 26, we did a long-term clinical course study. At mean age 26, if we say my spiritual life is highly important to me, it's where I heel strike, it's how I walk through life. Decisions, I turn to God. Friendships, I love when there's God in them. I love all people, but my friendships have God in them. That way of life at mean age 26, well, we got there over the past 10 years from 16 to 26 through a 250% increased risk for having suffered. It was through the knock of the door of despair, depression, that the young teen, emerging adult started to say, what is my purpose? And I mean, ultimate purpose. And what is my relationship to God? And you always said God is real, and my friends at college say it's not. Well, I have to find that on my own now. And yes, I'm learning logic and I need it. And yes, I'm learning empiricism and I need it. But equally valid, in fact, hard data is intuition, mystical experience, the uniting of multiple forms of knowing. When we look at people who use mystical experience alongside discernment, when they use intuition alongside logic, well, we literally pave the highways. We myelinate the tracks between the brains to have a more alert, innovative brain. And I mean, yes, we do better at work, but more importantly, we walk in alignment with the deep force, who I call God, in and through life. Well, that teen who does that work with you as a faith leader, with you as a parent, 80% less likely to be addicted, 4/5 less likely to take their life, 70% less likely to be harmed in a foolish risk. There's nothing that I would wish for my children more than that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm hearing you challenge us, frankly, to not shy away from the really hard stuff of life, but actually to step toward it and into it with space to name but also to understand. I love these words, that they are loved, held, guided, and never alone. I mean, those are powerful messages for every young person, every person to know and to believe and to hold on to.
And it's universal. We are born with the ability to see and know who I call God. We are born that way. I mean, we are born with the circuits that come together, the bonding network, the attention network, and the parietal that puts in and out in and out hard boundaries. So we know we're both unique and part of one family of life. We're born with all these circuits ready to be developed to hold presence. And you have the knowledge to help us walk into adult development as standing before our community as a contributor. Not all social support is the same. We don't just need social support, spiritual support, where the presence of God is in and through our connection. That's an entirely different form. So I teamed up with my colleague, Signe Luther. She wanted what she thought was a control group for the children in poverty she'd been trying to help for years. So she went to a highly resourced community. And when she gave the, highly resourced high school students the same measures of addiction, depression, anxiety, she was stunned that the rates of the diseases of despair are higher amongst teens in highly resourced communities than in the inner city.
Interesting.
More addiction, more depression, more suicidality. And so when I teamed up with Dr. Luther, I said, what do they look like spiritually? Well, the national rate at which a young adult says, I'm a profoundly spiritual person, my spirituality is highly important to me, I turn to God for guidance. They're in a lived relationship with their higher power. That's 70%. There's still a lot of very spiritually aware young people. But in highly resourced communities, what might you guess? 15, 1-5. Less than a quarter of the national rate. 85% of teens in highly resourced schools outside New York, outside San Francisco, on the coasts, these schools, 85% did not feel a strong connection to God or their higher power, only 15. And of course, those 15%, we know from all other studies, hundreds of peer-reviewed studies, the 15% with a strong spiritual core were protected. They were inured from the otherwise epidemic. It was a tidal wave walking through these schools, suffering.
Yeah.
So how do I get my kid in that 15%?
Right.
Faith leaders, we need you, because almost without exception, the rare student with a strong spiritual core amongst affluent culture right now is part of a faith community. Their family brings them at least twice a month, somewhere other. There's somewhere else to go where we love and look at each other with bright, sparkly eyes for walking in the door. I am so glad to see you as a soul on earth, as a child of God. I don't care if your dad was just on the front page of the paper for making $10 million or going to jail. I love you, and I'm so glad you've come. And if you've come in suffering, or if you've come in shame or guilt, we're here to be renewed. That is you look right through my eyes and my bio bodysuit and my clothes and my purse to my soul.
Yeah.
That is formation. That is awakening of the spiritual brain. And that is formation. Walking in the door alone is formation.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And then it just gets better.
Right. Yes. So thank you so much. I feel like we could go on and on, but we are asking all of our guests one final question to kind of wrap up each of our conversations. And that is for you to share with us, Dr. Miller, what is one way that you are being formed right now, and what difference is it making for you?
Thank you for asking. And because I didn't anticipate the question, you're going to get a very authentic, probably a little bit unformed answer. I have found that it's extremely important to speak up. I have found that it is extremely important right now to speak up from a deep, loving, authentic place, and to call this moment for what it is, because I look at the young people and some of us in all decades, but particularly the young adults, and their life depends on it.
I love that that's where you're coming from with this, because this is exactly what you're asking the church to do, not to be timid, but to speak up and to speak into this moment. And that in doing that, as a congregation, we will be formed, let alone as spiritual leaders. So I love that when I ask you how you're being formed when you speak up. That is part of your formation. That's a beautiful word to end on.
That's very true for all of us. Yes.
Yes. Dr. Miller, you are doing amazing work, and you are calling us to live into our calling as religious and spiritual leaders, and as the church. So bless you for being that scientist behind the lens that is pointing toward the need for spiritual formation and ultimately love. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm so grateful for your partnership.